Well, I can't imagine any better city in the world to hold a resilience conference and workshop. I think Katrina was the wake-up call to the world that preparedness, urban preparedness, was something that is critical going forward for city planners, city builders, politicians, environmentalists to be thinking about. So I have 30 minutes to give you some sense of what resilience is, to give you some sense of what's taken me 4 or 5 years to glean. So I'm going to be going at a very high level. I'm going to be around for the next 2 days, circulating between tables, so that if you've missed anything or I haven't been clear enough, please feel free to grab me and ask me questions. So first of all, I think over the last 20 or 30 years, the discourse about sustainability, environmentalism, has been very much about what we as a species are doing to our planet, the kind of harm we're causing through pollution, through CO2 emissions, etc. But very recently, there's another discourse that's been evolving, and that is the discourse of the actual impacts that we've had on our planet are starting to have reverberations and impacts back on us. And those impacts are being felt in our cities, in our rural communities, everywhere around the world. And so to come to terms with that, not only do we have to be thinking about how we can continue to reduce the harm we're doing as a species to the planet, but also at the same time, how we're going to deal with the impacts that the world is now having back upon us. So I think that the discourse now going forward is a reciprocal discourse. It's a discourse about reducing harm at the same time as understanding how we will build resilience to those shocks and stresses that we will be continuing with greater frequency and intensity to experience in the future. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. To put this in some kind of larger context, I think what we exist in today in our cities and our communities are what I refer to as the carbon city. The city where most of our energy is carbon-based, most of our production uses fuels and materials that are carbon-based. And over the next 20, 30 years, we have to figure out how to get from being carbon-based to non-carbon-based, so we can go from being carbon cities to regenerative cities, repairing some of the damage we've already done to our ecosystems, to our planet. And hopefully, the end state of all of this is what I would call a symbiotic city, where we're no longer parasites on our planet, but we're actually symbionts. We give back as much as we take, and that's some ways off. But in the meantime, and where resilience fits in, I think, is that we have to hold the fort. That there's going to be a lot of shocks and stresses coming back to us from the damage we've already done. So we're going to have to start to build resilience into our communities and to our cities. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about in this 30 minutes. And what you're going to be doing the very hard work over the next 2 days, although I think it's going to be a lot of fun, in starting to make sense of in the context of North America. So first of all, what is resilience? I'm going to be talking about attributes of resilience, the 6 key drivers of shocks and stresses, and what some of those shocks and stresses are going to be. I'm going to talk at a very high level because of the time constraint, but I think it will be worthwhile for your workshop over the next couple of days. So what is resilience? Common definition by, say, dictionary.com would be resilience is the power, ability to return to original form, position, etc., after being bent, compressed, stretched, or elasticity. Think of a rubber band. Or the ability to recover readily from illness, depression, adversity, or the like, buoyancy. So I think both of those are actually quite applicable when you think of cities. But the term that I've come to, or the definition I've come to use is the one based on C.S. Hollings. He's an environmentalist, or I should say an ecologist, and really started in the 70s to understand resilience of ecosystems. And we've worked over the last 3 or 4 years to develop a definition that seemed to make sense for the urban situation. That is, resilience is the capacity of a community's economic, social, political, and physical infrastructure systems to absorb shocks and stresses and still retain their basic function and structure. Now, interestingly, Thomas Homer Dixon, one of the more thoughtful writers on resilience and resource issues in his book, The Upside of Down, recently, made the point that resilience is an emergent property of a system. It's a gestalt. And the problem with that, as he says, it's not the result of any one of the system's parts, but of the synergy between all of its parts. So the big problem with resilience then is, unlike measuring the amount of CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere, you can't measure resilience until after the fact. You can't measure how resilient a community was, how resilient a city was, until after an impact, a shock, a stress has happened, and then you can see how resilient it is. What you can do is start to put in place strategies and approaches that will build resilience. So resilience to which shocks and stresses? Which are the important shocks and stresses that we have to be thinking about as we look at building resilience in our communities? This is the list of what I call the Big 10. I won't dwell on these. I think they're shocks and stresses that have occurred through time. And as we go forward in the future, what we'll be seeing is, depending on the kind of drivers that I'll be talking about, some will be more present and others less. But economic shocks and stresses, environmental, energy supply, price shocks, infrastructure failures, think of what happened in Katrina, population change and migrations, food shortages, price shocks, severe weather events, disease, pandemics, regional resource conflicts, terrorism, bio, cyber, dirty nukes, etc. So that's the sort of list of the kind of shocks and stresses that cities and communities might face. And the key here when we're talking about building resilience is to understand the drivers of these shocks and stress. What is behind producing these shocks and stresses? Well, I think there are 6 key drivers. First is climate change. And second is population growth and migration. Third is energy supply. And by this, I don't mean peak oil. It's all things related to getting energy from creating it, getting it from one point to another. Environmental degradation, resource conflicts between regions, and of course, socio-political conflicts. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time on these two because I think going forward, these will probably be the most important drivers of shocks and stresses to our communities and cities over the next 25 years. And these are the ones that we'll have to be looking at building resilience strategies and approaches for to make our cities and our communities more resilient. So climate change, all of you are aware that we have a problem with carbon dioxide production. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've been continuing to pump more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is not new news, but I can tell you that as of yesterday, nothing has changed on this. And of course, as you know, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere has a corollary of driving temperatures up on average across the planet. So this is something that has not changed over the last 10 years. All of the attempts at finding ways to reduce carbon dioxide through efficiency, through legislation, have not had any discernible impact on the amount of carbon dioxide being generated. And as you can see, temperatures following them up. And looking forward, unless something changes, and I think there are some opportunities for change, carbon dioxide production will continue to not only increase but accelerate. The blue line up here is the United States carbon dioxide production, and the red is China. China is very quickly catching up to the United States, and the rest of the lines below are the rest of the major industrial countries in the world. So what I would like to do, you're all very familiar with climate change, I would like to give you some sense of one of the really key things that's going to drive shocks and stresses as a result of climate change. And this is the impact that climate will have on agriculture. And as you are well aware, there are two bands of desert around the world, and these are caused by what are called the Hadley cells at about 25 degrees altitude on either side, or I should say latitude on either side of the equator. And these are caused by the hot, moist air rising up from the equator, equatorial regions, dropping all of their moisture to create the rainforests of the world, and then coming back down to Earth. And as they come back down to Earth, they've lost their moisture, and as they come down, Boyle's law causes them to increase in temperature, and they come down as very hot and dry air, causing the desertification of those bands. Climate scientists are predicting that as time goes on, and as we increase the average temperature of the atmosphere, that these Hadley cells will tend to expand northward and southward. And if you look at where they're expanding over what are now the world's bread basket, where the world produces rice, corn, and wheat. And so that means that not only is the world's population increasing, but the number of arable acres to be able to produce food is decreasing. So whether this comes as gradual stress of decreasing numbers of arable acres of land, or shocks when one particular ecosystem collapses and brings down production of grain or corn at some part of the world, it will certainly be something that we'll be looking forward in the future to happening over the next 20, 25 years. So the second thing that is really worth considering when we talk about resilience is how population growth and migration are going to have an impact on cities in the future. The good news is that the overall rate of population is falling. The bad news is that over the next 25 years, we will be adding 2 billion people to the planet. And irrespective of the Hadley cells and climate change, that is going to drive demand on food, and therefore the cost of food. And unless we can find ways to produce food in new ways and cost-effective ways, cities will be seeing both stresses, long-term stresses, as well as particular shocks and stresses as price changes happen. We're harvesting most of the big fish species out of the oceans. The huge cod industry has collapsed in 1992, and there are a number of other major species that are headed for collapse over the next 10 to 20 years. Population migrations, as you're all very familiar, there are population moving across continents, but more interestingly, there's also what's called the third great migration of rural populations into cities. So we're going to be adding, by 2050, about 3.1 billion people to cities. So there's an increase of 2 billion people, but there's actually a greater number coming to cities. So that in itself will be a stress. How we deal with it, how we make our cities more resilient to that, and actually potentially benefit from that, which I'll be talking about in the next presentation an hour from now, will be key. But interestingly, these drivers are not separate from one another. They tend to multiply one another's effects, and they also tend to interact with one another, so that climate change will obviously have some impact on population migrations. It will have some impact on resource issues, and so forth. So how do we start to build capacity for resilience to these future shocks and stresses? I think there are 6 important attributes of resilience, and I'm getting a 15-minute time signal here, so this is going to be a little faster than I thought. Key: flexibility, redundancy, diversity, decoupling, decentralization, and environmental integration. Flexibility is pretty obvious. Making our cities and our communities more flexible to change stresses will be key to building resilience. Redundancy is very important. Redundancy has been a dirty word over the last 20 years in management and engineering circles. Just think about how just-in-time manufacturing and product supply has been lauded as the way to build profit, for example, in retail systems. But what happens if one point of that just-in-time network fails? The whole thing collapses. So having redundancy in cities, for example, say redundancy of water supply, redundancy of electrical power supply, is going to be very important for building resiliency. Diversity. Think of the difference between the resiliency of a monoculture, a cornfield, and a very rich ecosystem understory in a forest. A bug, a virus, a mold in a cornfield can wipe it out, whereas one in a very rich ecosystem may harm a few plants, but not hurt the overall ecosystem. So diversity in how our cities are construed and constructed, the number of elements involved. Think of, a big box, one big box store versus many small retails. Certainly many small retail is going to be more diverse. Decoupling. Cars following too closely behind on a freeway, and when someone hits the brakes, you've got a crash. The same thing happens with cities now, very connected economically. One city somewhere, one community somewhere fails, something goes wrong, it has ripple effect throughout. It doesn't mean that we should disconnect completely, but what it does mean is that we should build resilience into the fact that we're connected, so that if something happens somewhere else, that it doesn't cause complete collapse in the community that we're living in. And then decentralization. The classic starfish and the spider comparison. Cut a leg of a starfish off, and what happens? The leg grows a new body, and the body grows a new leg. We're cut off the head of a spider, and the spider dies. Decentralization means that if one part of a community or city is affected, then the controls, the response, the ability for it to respond to that shock or stress is not completely destroyed. And environmental integration. Understanding the environment that a community resides in is very, very important. Failing to understand the real implications of the environment that you're in, and of course this is in New Orleans after Katrina, is catastrophic. And so I will now turn it over to Greg. And Greg has asked if I would take a few questions. I'd be happy to take a few questions for a few minutes. Any questions? Yes.
Generally, I'm pretty loud, so generally I can be heard. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Very, very enlightening, and I know very quick. So let me ask you, as you discuss each of these elements, what I don't think I heard, but may have missed it, is the cumulative impacts. When we who work in environmental justice communities who are suffering from many of these ills to start with, so we're starting from a place of non-resilience to begin with, poverty, lack of affordable housing, lack of good economic opportunities on top of environmental pollution and health effects from that. So folks are starting in a different place. We're all in the world not starting in the same place. How do you incorporate the issue of cumulative impact into the methodology that you're talking about today?
Well, first of all, that's an excellent question. And I'd say that's a question people should be thinking about as they work through their various tasks today and tomorrow. Resilience is certainly a cumulative thing, and the various things within a community contribute to it. So for example, if a community has economic resources at its disposal, then it can solve a lot of problems. If it doesn't, then it's got a much harder trek ahead of it. So I think certainly building resilience is not easy. It's not like simply saying, well, let's pass some legislation, we're going to create resilience. Resilience is something that's done over time. And it's certainly something that's been neglected. We haven't in the past really thought about how we make decisions that not only have immediate, tangible economic results like to the GDP, but how do we make decisions that while they are having positive results to a GDP, to the microeconomy of a community, they're also building resilience into the community. So yes, there's certainly inequity. There's certainly issues where one community will have a much harder time building resilience than another. But I think the principles I tried to elucidate here are ones that are sort of overarching. And then from there, we'll start to look at how we build resilient strategies, understanding what the key drivers are that we have to deal with. But you're talking about how to deal with it, and then in my next presentation, I'm going to give a few approaches of how we might go after that. So thank you very much. Any others? Yes.
Hello, my name is Sheila Cole. I'm advisor to the board of the Nova Scotia Environmental Network, and have participated in cities discussions also through UN Habitat. And we always learn about how the density of cities is going to be increasing over the next couple of decades.
Which is a good thing.
Well, that's the question that I want to ask, is in terms of resilience, should we be looking at whether this is what we really want to be happening? You know, I think the increase of population in cities to a large extent has to do with globalization and development issues and, you know, the delivery of goods and services and so on. So it has been convenient from a systems point of view to deliver those things. But it, you know, is having most of our population in cities really the way that we want to go? It's kind of a question that lingers. And so I just thought that perhaps we could consider that a little bit.
This is a very, very good question. And it's actually one of the key approaches that I talk about next time, in the next presentation. But I will preempt myself a little bit by saying I think density and increasing population size of the cities is not only going to be a necessary thing, because we're adding 2 billion people. They've got to go somewhere. So where do they go? Adding that number of people to the planet means we have to have strategies for incorporating the population in a way that is ecologically and economically feasible. And I think densities and cities are probably the best way to do it. I'm going to tell you why. A lot of people think cities and large cities, densities, are the problem. They're not. They are the solution. Pulling ourselves off of the land and into cities has the greatest chance of helping us solve many of our environmental problems than anything else. But anyway, I'll talk about that later. Great intro for
Well, that's very good news. And the other thing is that obviously the document that's produced here in the next couple of days is going to have great ramifications. And I see it as an opportunity for us to grapple more with changing away from the way that we have measured progress, so away from the GDP and more into real cost accounting and genuine progress index and ones like that. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We'll just take one more question.
Congratulations for your presentation. Your focus is very interesting, but I don't see in the attributes for the resilience social organization. You say flexibility, you say adaptability, you say adaptability with the environmental process, but I don't see social organization. What think about this?
That's a very good question. I think as a urban designer and architect, I tend to use words that speak to physical building fabric and infrastructure. However, resilience ultimately is about individual people and how they're going to live in a community. All of the attributes of resilience, redundancy and flexibility and diversity, those are all attributes that are scalable from the individual through the community to a city to the planet. And how they interact at various scales is a very important question. And I think it's one of the questions that you'll find yourself asking and trying to resolve in your discussions today. And by the way, let me apologize for how brief and sort of overview my presentation was. This is typically an hour presentation with a lot more examples, but because most of you are experts in this anyway and coming together, my job, I felt, was really to communicate sort of some of the structure for discussion. So your question is a very good one. Thank you. And by the way, thank you for the questions and coming together to do something that's very, very important. Resilience has only been discussed for the last 4 years or so. And this happening at the sort of epicenter of what might be called the world of resilience in New Orleans is very important. So thank you.